Good morning, everybody. I'm Will Landers. I'm the president of the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Chamber to welcome all of you to today's webinar. I'm especially thankful for the distinguished lineup of speakers that we have lined up for you. And of course, I extend a warm thank you for all of you that signed up to participate. For over 55 years, the Chamber has served as a bridge between Brazil and the United States, fostering dialogue, strengthening business relationships, and promoting the flow of trade, investment, and ideas between our two countries. In moments like this, when policy decisions have a potential to reshape markets and impact industries on both sides, it's our role to bring the business community together to better understand the challenges ahead and identify paths forward. Today's discussion focuses on the recent tariff announcements of the Trump administration, specifically the proposed 50% tariff on imports from Brazil and the impact for companies operating in this vital bilateral corridor. It's an issue with important economic, political, and commercial implications, and we hope that this forum will provide useful perspectives for all of you and clarity where possible. Thank you all for registering again and for joining us virtually. We're pleased to have such strong engagement from both sides of the hemisphere, and we look forward to a timely and thoughtful discussion. We have six speakers lined up, so I'm going to not go through all of them right now, but I'm going to pass the word on to Chris Garman, who's the Managing Director for the Americas of Eurasia Group, who will give his opening remarks. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for the invitation here to participate in such a distinguished panel of speakers in a very, I would say, historic and important moment in the U.S.-Brazil relationship. Let me just kind of begin, as a scene setter as to kind of how I interpret the announcement coming out of the Trump White House for a 50% tariff on Brazilian products. What I would say, it didn't come as an entire surprise, but the decision itself was somewhat surprising. What do I mean by that? It didn't come as an entire surprise because we all knew that the bilateral relationship between Brazil and the United States, could be very poisonous. When we began at the beginning of the year, we at the Eurasia Group identified this as a potential flashpoint. We were very concerned that ultimately you look at the U.S. politics and Brazilian politics, one is the mirror of the other. It is uncanny. The similarities of the extent to which both countries faced a highly polarized backdrop. Both countries have political parties and movements which see each other as an existential threat to democracy. President Donald Trump, when he looks at the predicament of President Jair Bolsonaro, he sees himself in the challenges that Jair Bolsonaro faces in Brazil. President Donald Trump, views that he suffered a political witch hunt in the courts, that he was engaged and was a victim of a version of political censorship by a progressive establishment that engaged in censorship, overt, let's say, action by social media companies. So when, the Bolsonaro family comes to the president and says that Brazil is living through a regime of political censorship, particularly in context where U.S. social media companies, particularly X, faced legal action by the courts, this resonates in the MAGA movement. It resonates with President Trump himself. You add the fact that Brazil was hosting the BRICS summit and has a slow drift towards China, and the perfect storm was laid out for a very poor bilateral relationship. It was somewhat surprising because there was no movement on the relationship, for the first 5 months of the administration. Brazil was out of the 2nd April, Liberation Day tariffs, and in part I think it was because of the decision making within the White House that had a lot on their hands. President Trump was unhappy with the rules for the reciprocal tariff, and then they ended up adopting a rule based exclusively on trade tariffs. That was a rule made up by Peter Navarro. And so Brazil kind of went into second plane. It wasn't a priority. And maybe in retrospect, it was just a matter of time before, all of these factors reared their ugly head. And it looks like the trigger may have been the BRICS summit on the one hand, and the second round of letters that were being sent by the White House on the other. You add Eduardo Bolsonaro's actions and the president acted the way that he did. Interestingly, it doesn't seem to be a decision that was vetted by USTR Commerce, so it was a decision taken by President Trump. But I think that the political backdrop evidently is kind of what explains this decision. Obviously, that's a little bit of backdrop. What matters is where do we go from here? Let me give you, the bad news and the not so bad news. I think, the bad news is I don't see a quick and easy resolution towards this impasse. The items that are on the Trump letter, are strictly political. It puts front and center the trial of President Bolsonaro. It put front and center the regulation of social media companies by the federal Supreme Court. Those are non-negotiable items, on the Brazilian side. President Lula couldn't even deliver on those items if he wanted to, given that they're legal matters by the federal Supreme Court, and even if he could, he wouldn't either. So there's very little give when it comes to the grievances expressed by the White House. Equally importantly, the presidential palace, the political wing of the presidential palace is frankly, maybe delighted is too strong of a word, but they are certainly looking at all this as a political opportunity that they can ride a wave of nationalism. They are encouraged by the fact that they'll be able to associate President Jair Bolsonaro and his family as aligning with a government that is taking away jobs from Brazil. They look abroad and they look at instances in which other leaders have benefited by overt quote unquote bully tactics from the Trump administration. The hallmark example, of course, is the Liberal Party in Canada that was resuscitated from the dead and ended up winning the election with a very hard stance from the Trump administration vis-a-vis all things Canada. Similar phenomena seen in the approval ratings in Calvert Sheinbaum rising. Macron, some European leaders also saw their approval ratings rising, Australia as well. And so I think the presidential palace sees a political opportunity for a heavy-handed Trump administration, and they have a political incentive to adopt a more confrontational rhetoric given public opinion. So you kind of have, on the one hand, a very difficult or impossible kind of demands to be met by the Brazilians, and you have a political incentive to be able to take a tough stance that you can benefit politically in a context where Lula was losing popular support over the first half of the year. So the Lula administration kind of feels a little bit on the roll. Not only have they they have gotten a political communication strategy right when it comes to defending their taxes by going after the rich to defend the poor. They are benefiting from a bumper agricultural harvest, so food prices are coming down. So that tends to lead to a modest recovery in the pool ratings. And now you got the Trump administration's policies, and we're already seeing some polls showing a modest recovery in Lula's numbers. In fact, Atlas Intel, I think, published a poll this morning showing that his numbers are bumping up. So we're going to have probably an upswing in Lula's numbers, and that makes it a bit hard for the Brazilians to come and give a political win to the Trump administration, follow the script of being subservient, following the script of complimenting the president, playing to his ego. We see some of the script of other trade partners in the negotiations. We don't see that coming from the Brazilians. Now, does that mean that we're headed in towards a tit for tat trade war when 1 August rolls around? And the question then becomes, will Brazilians retaliate to these trade tariffs if we're not going to get a climb down until the 1 of August? And here I would say that the not so bad news is that, there are strong incentives for the Brazilians to try to punt a response and buy time for negotiations. I think that the Brazilians understand that if they were to retaliate, on tariff measures or non-tariff measures, and by the way, if you speak to Brazilian negotiators, what they've been saying over the past, 5 to 6 months is that rather than retaliate vis-a-vis tariffs, which would hurt Brazilian consumers, and Lula's political Achilles heel is cost of living, that the more a more intelligent response would be to potentially go after intellectual property rights and patents and try to be able to benefit Brazilian consumers and hurt some U.S. companies. But that, of course, is escalatory. That's a big deal if you go down that path, right? What the best case scenario, which I kind of see, is that 1 August rolls around. The Brazilians, they just regulated the reciprocity law that will establishes the parameters for retaliation. You announce that you begin a process by which you can retaliate, but you give time for negotiations to unfold. On the American side, there probably are some items for self-interested reasons that you may want to exempt from the 50% tariff. You could probably exempt oil. You could probably exempt critical minerals. There are some items of which U.S. consumers rely heavily on Brazilian products. 30% of coffee comes from Brazil. And so you may begin to initiate a process by which you try to do some carve-outs on the 50%. Maybe some sectors you can announce additional investments to be able to placate Trump, and Lula kind of holds off on the retaliation and gives time for these negotiations to unfold. And so what you essentially have is a muddle through of the current equilibrium and try to be able to avoid kind of a tit for tat retaliation in the bilateral relationship. Can we have a negotiated solution led by the administration in which you are able to meaningfully lower tariffs, back to a less trade prohibitive level of 20% potentially? I think that's probably the less likely outcome in the short term. Obviously, what does this mean for Brazil? Kind of big picture. These levels are trade prohibitive on some items. From a macroeconomic point of view, I think others can identify, but most banks are forecasting anywhere from a 0.2, 0.3% hit of GDP. It represents 12% of Brazilian exports. Some of the exports are fungible. You could probably direct them elsewhere. Some of the industrial products are harder to do so. Obviously, the company that's hit hardest is Embraer, on this. So you take a little bit of a hit from an economic point of view. You avoid and you impede what has been a trend of a currency appreciation given the dollar weakness globally. So that's not good news from an inflation point of view. But it doesn't seem to be a major macroeconomic hit and one in which the administration can potentially swallow. You take a step back, and if we have a version of higher tariffs with carve-outs, so the bilateral trading relationship isn't entirely broken, but you're able to patch something together, I think we're probably moving towards a world where Brazil will deepen their trade relationships with other trading partners. Obviously, looking to deepen relationships with China. Brazil is likely to conclude a EU-Mercosur trade deal. So I think that closer ties with the European Union are likely. And this is a phenomenon that we're seeing globally. Countries are trying not to antagonize with the United States, but they are engaging in hedging strategies to rely a bit less on the U.S. more broadly. So it is kind of a two-stage strategy where you try to be able to mitigate the damage on the one hand, but you're already looking to deepen trade relationships elsewhere. I think Brazil will probably go down that path. The two promising markets are European Union, probably China, looking to deepen relationships with some Middle Eastern countries and potentially Mexico. But those are slow moving turns. So it's not something that you can do so quickly. And you kind of hope for the best. And, maybe there's a hope that maybe IEPA can fall from a legal point of view. It's very hard to be able to figure out the legal case, whether that will hold by the end of the year. You can't bet on that in the next couple of months. But who knows whether these levels will hold heading into the next couple of years. And so you buy time. But I would say that we are very worried about a escalatory cycle, even though it's in a preliminary way, we're not betting on it, but there is a political imperative for Lula to respond. If Lula responds, then the Trump White House will respond. If Lula responds on IP, then maybe the Trump White House may not restrict themselves only to tariffs. And so that is a dangerous territory, right? Where the economic consequences could be larger if you move out of the commercial leg. So it's a delicate moment. The politics aren't good on the Brazilian side and on the U.S. side. And the role that Bolsonaro could play as an intermediate to have a climb down doesn't seem as if the Bolsonaro family is going down that way. They're digging their heels to try to be able to get an amnesty law. And that has important repercussions for 2026. Not only does it incrementally strengthen Lula, but it creates a fissure on the right because the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas, is listening more to the industries in his home state and is creating a division with the Bolsonaro family that wants a tougher stance to be able to keep the tariffs, to be able to force an amnesty law at home. So it may impact Bolsonaro's choice as to who would represent him in 2026 as well. So lots of moving parts here, extraordinarily consequential. I would end by saying here in my 14 minutes, Will, that coming up here on the clock, that it probably helps Lula in the short term. How much it helps him in 2026 is a bit more of an open question. I mean, the election is a year and 4 months away. It's not just 4 months away. So, we have to look at the economic repercussions of this. It tends to be modest, but if we're in an escalatory cycle, it could undermine him a bit. And what Lula wants is a world with less inflation. Lula wants a world with a stronger real. Because food inflation was the main culprit for his drop in support. Therefore, I'm looking at what all this impacts, some of these macroeconomic variables, but clearly in the near term, he will benefit politically from it and he'll have some wind behind his sails. So let me conclude here.
Chris, thanks very much. That was great. And clearly, we're going to have to do a separate panel later on in the year when we start focusing more on the elections on all these topics because they're super interesting. And I'm sure we would have a lot of questions there. But thanks very much. I think just one comment is like, as you mentioned, inflation is a big issue for Lula's administration. I wonder when that starts to become an issue here in the United States. But again, that's a different topic that we'll leave for another time. Moving on to our next speaker, we have with us Fabrício Sardelli Panzini, who is the Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs at MTM Brazil, so our sister company in São Paulo. So, Fabrício, it'd be great to hear from you what you're hearing from your members there in São Paulo. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Good morning. Thanks for invitation from you, Roberto, and all the chamber. First, Will, what's this Brazil-US relation? And I have to say it's a very positive when we look at the economic side. It's a very positive win-win relationship. Brazil and US have very strong economic ties. US and Brazil has a bicentenary relationship. Lots of companies, American companies, are in Brazil more than 100 years operating in Brazil. A lot of them has Brazil as their second, third, or fourth market in the world. And the US, with investments, have participated directly of Brazil's industrialization process among the last century. And for Brazil, what does the US represent? The US is our second trading partner, but as we say here at AmCham, the US is our first economic partner. Why? Because it's the second on trading goods, but the first one when you look at services, the first one when you look at investments, by far in terms of services and by far in terms of foreign investments in Brazil. Also, when you look at the value aggregate of products that Brazil sells to the US, the US is the first one in manufacturing exports from Brazil and also in high-tech products. And that's what makes the equation for Brazil a little bit complicated, as we're going to speak a little bit in the sequence here. Speaking a little bit more about this relationship and looking at the criterias of the US when the US is imposing tariffs. I mean, Brazil is not a threat to the US when it comes to trade. That's because the US has a large trade surplus with Brazil. Actually, Brazil is the fourth largest trade surplus of the US in the world. A lot of sectors that the US has deficits with other countries, the US has a positive surplus with Brazil. That includes machineries, includes pharmaceuticals, includes electronics, includes airplanes, for instance. So Brazil, it is actually a country where the US is actually balancing its deficit with the world. And also the countries have some value chains that are very important in both sides for well remunerated, high-paying jobs, sectors such as airplanes, which is the most important example, or machinery. Well, and that's why we think here at AmCham that the private sector will be key to solve this issue. Actually, since 2004, we are engaging with both governments, showing path that we think that Brazil and US can cooperate much more. We have a lot to win if we amplify a little bit the agenda. We have many opportunities that I will talk a little bit in the end. Recently, we have launched an observatory here at AmCham. It's on our website. We have all the analysis of all the measures that Trump administration has released and how it affects Brazil. We have also been following with some statements. We have just released it 10 minutes ago, a statement with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So AmCham Brazil, together with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, showing the bad effects that this measure will lead in both of our economies. So talking a little bit about these effects. When we talk about the U.S. market, we think there will be two main effects. First, on prices. Chris mentioned a little bit coffee, meat, and juice that are products that Brazil leads the world in terms of export. So there's not many sources that the US can rely. So American breakfast and American, let's say, supermarket can be more expensive because of this measure. Also, the US cannot substitute internally because some climate issues, for instance, when it comes to orange juice or fruits in general, or the cattle reduction in the US is also a source of the US cannot just increase its meat production in the short term. Also, in some value chains, airplanes, for instance, and steel and aluminum, especially steel, you can have some disruption because when you have 50% is different of having 10%. So you might have some disruption. You might have some supply. You have canceling some of the purchase in the US. So we have to look very carefully to that. In Brazil, of course, manufacturing, production, and jobs, especially the sectors that I mentioned, they will be very much impacted because the type of products that Brazil sells to the US is unique on Brazilian, let's say, export basket. But before I come to that, I would like to say that another aspect that I see is China or other Asian countries deviating Brazilian exports in the US market, and that will actually not cooperate with the strategy of the US to reduce its trade debts. Actually, it can actually foster the deficit of the US with countries in Asia, for instance, because Brazil, the country that has a deficit with the US, can be substituted by other exports from countries that actually has a surplus with the US. So that's something that it's a little bit a paradox. It's a little bit, hard to understand, but that can be an important effect. Of course, we know all the political issues that are behind it. It's not only economic, but it's curious to look at one of the effects that we will see is probably deepening of the U.S. deficit with Asian countries or China, for instance. When we had the 10% tariff that Brazil had until, still has a 10% tariff for most products, 25% for other products, we were feeling the effects, for instance, on pulp, wood, auto parts, machinery, but companies were able a little bit to negotiate the prices. and maintain some market in the US, especially those products that Brazil is very competitive. For instance, as I mentioned, coffee, meat, juice, airplanes, and others. But when it comes to 50%, that will impose almost an impossible obstacle to overcome. And for Brazil, it's a very delicate issue because the type of products that Brazil sells to China, for instance, is much more agriculture, is iron ore or oil. Only oil in this case, you might substitute the US. But when it comes to machinery, when it comes to auto parts, when it comes to airplanes, when it comes to air parts, it's difficult to substitute the US in the short term. So that will be an economic issue for Brazil. The letter from Mr. Trump to our President Lula, it's important to say, to reinforce that, has a lot of wrong informations when it comes to trade. As I mentioned, Brazil has actually a deficit with the US, and also Brazil has very low tariffs to the US products. We have made some calculation here at AmCham with the real tariff that American exporters pays to Brazil, and it's 2.7. It's lower than the tariff that we charge to the world, which is in average more than 5%. So the US enjoys a tariff of almost half of everything the world pays to Brazil. As I mentioned, I mean, the US has a 15 years in a row of surplus, positive surplus with Brazil. So it's difficult to see this economically as being something that can explain this measure from the US to Brazil, which is, it's not economic, we know it. To solve this, and coming to the end of my speech here, I mean, as we have been talking to the Brazilian government, and they say that negotiation is the first, the second, and the third option. Brazil wants to solve this with dialogue. Actually, today and tomorrow, a lot of ministries in Brazil are doing a roundtable with the private sector, trying to understand the effects and also the paths that we can have to solve this. I think retaliation is only on the worst case scenario, and Brazil wouldn't do retaliation in terms of goods. It would probably go either for services or for intellectual property, as Chris Garman has just spoken a little bit. In our case, as AmCham, we're going to continue to advocate for a negotiated solution. We do think it's possible. And we have to look at the broader agenda. I mean, for instance, energy. Brazil and the US has a historical positive agenda on energy. Decarbonization of oil and gas, for instance, is a very big agenda. On defense, both countries has very deep ties. We do think also another frontier is on critical minerals. Brazil has second or third large reserves in some critical minerals, and the second one in the world on rare earth. We do need to international cooperation to refine and process critical minerals in Brazil, and the US is a partner that Brazil has long history and a partner that we could trust to foster this agenda. So I really hope, as private sector in AmCham and our companies here, really hope that this agenda on the 50% doesn't go on, especially it doesn't inhibit many agendas that we can have a win-win for both countries, as I just mentioned here. And I think maybe this can be an opportunity for both countries to look at the broader, wake up and look at the broader agenda. I know in terms of political orientation, our countries are a little bit different, but let's not forget that we are the two largest economies in the continent of America. And if Brazil and US have a good understanding, I think the whole continent is more safe, is more stable, and that's good for the economy, good for our people. So thanks a lot again for the invitation. I leave the floor, I think, to you, Will.
Yep, Fabrizio,
And
thanks very
again.
much. Great remarks. And obviously here at the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, we look forward to continuing to work very closely with the AmCham, given that our goals are very similar. Thanks again for your participation. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and move to Guilherme Melhado Miranda, who's the managing director for the Americas for Suzano Pulp and Paper, the largest pulp and paper company in the world. Obviously, it would be great to get from a corporate perspective views on these recent announcements and how you guys are looking at it. Guilherme, on to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, and thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to speak with you all here today. I think from our perspective, especially me being the leader of our company in the USA, was a big surprise when the recent tariffs were announced. I think in not even my remote nightmares, I could imagine that this would come. And obviously, and coincidentally, I was in Brazil visiting one of our mills with one of our customers from North America. So can you imagine my 2 days with those guys during the news coming out and etc. were not easy, right? So a lot of questions, a lot of what ifs, and what would happen. So for I think we're monitoring all the movements made by the U.S. government since the first round of tariff implementations, and we understood that at that point in time, Brazil was not a part of the big focus of the American government, especially because of our trade let's say imbalance that I think Fabrizio already commented here, right? So Brazil imports more from the U.S. than we export, and if you add up other products besides the industrial goods, it's even more in favor of the U.S. So in our point of view, I think it's very worrying that let's say we couldn't see that coming from a political perspective, I would say. But at the same time, we have a highly trust that our government will be embedded in finding a negotiated outcome for that. So, and that's why we preach here every day with our colleagues, and what we are trying to help our government to reach out, right? So I think with a negotiated outcome is the best for both of countries. And I would say, looking into the perspective of Suzano and how important we are for several customers we have in the U.S., and I think it's important to reinforce, Suzano has been operating in the U.S. for the last 40 years, and we have a very close relationship with lots of important brands and big customers in North America. They are heavily dependent on our pulp to produce their products. I will give an example, and not only talking about Suzano, but about the whole pulp industry in Brazil. So Brazil represents 83% of the total hardwood pulp that U.S. imports on a single year. That's a relevant number. It's around 2.5 million tons of pulp that goes into the U.S. market. And that pulp is very unique and very important to the customers in North America, because it generates a high quality toilet paper or hygiene paper that can be substituted by other kinds of pulps that can be imported from Canada, for example, or other players in the world. So this, let's say, value chain kind of established itself during those several years by importing this highly competitive, high quality pulp from Brazil and creating this high quality products with that. And I think by having this shock would be a huge hit for both sides of the business, right? Obviously, I think for Suzano itself, we will find ways of selling those products to other markets. But the best outcome, obviously, is keeping the relationships we have established for several years in North America, and we value a lot that. And I myself consider myself a very admirer of these relationships and a stakeholder of that inside the company. So we're trying with all means possible to kind of help to find a negotiated outcome for that and support the Brazilian government and even our partners in the US to find a negotiated outcome for that also. Very hard to predict now from our side what will come, because I think the the lack of visibility of the next steps, it's maybe a factor right now. So I don't know if it was commented already, but the letter itself is not the executive order, or so it lacks a little bit of legal frame into how it would be applied, when it would be applied, etc. So we're still looking into finding answer for that, and to understand better how this will be operated on, let's say, in a more practical way. But we're looking into, again, find solutions and help our partners here in North America, in the US, and in Brazil, and our government in Brazil, to find an outcome or negotiate an outcome for that. In a more broader perspective, I think talking about like of the business itself, right? If this tariff sustains and it keeps in place, I think it will be a huge setback for the whole Brazilian industry, right? We have been a very important trading partner with the US for so many years. And by losing the market in that size, I think it's not something you can just ignore, right? It's something that we need to really look into and reflect on how we can avoid those setbacks in the future, how we can be close and kind of predicting next steps and negotiating those things in advance. So we're obviously anxiously waiting for new signs and more information around that. As Fabrizio already commented, there is a huge group of Brazilian industrial companies that it's reunited today with Vice President Alckmin here in Brasilia to discuss a little bit the outcomes and next steps of this discussion with the path for this discussion with the U.S. government. And we're willing to and waiting anxiously to hear some good news coming into that front, right? No, Will, if you have any questions or anyone online that wants to send some questions here.
Just one quick question, Guilherme, before we move on. From the clients here in North America, what have you heard from them with regards to this, given their dependency on Brazilian high quality?
I think first positioning, I would say first reactions were a shock, right? So nobody could see that coming. And I think a lot of them question ourselves regarding how much inventories we have in North America to supply them, how else we can do to kind of increase the stocks and in advance of the tariff implementation. I think this is pretty much of what everyone is looking into right now to organize that and guarantee that we have some leeway into the real, let's say, impact of the tariff coming into the cost of our products. And I think there's a second question of, well, now what, right? So considering that the 50% would be a reality, who's going to pay that? And obviously, pulp is a commodity. We don't have that margin to subsidize the product. So the reality is that there is only one answer for that, right? The consumer in North America will have to bear the cost of this additional cost in the end. It could be, if you look, there's two ways of looking into that, right? So one is customers will not look into different solutions and will keep buying and pay the 50% tariff. There's a second way by saying that you are removing, in the case of pulp, 50% of the global competitors from your market. So what happens if you do that with the market, right? Obviously, prices will move up also because you have less availability, less competition, etc. So I think one or another, I think the inflation for those products and the derived products from pulp will come. And I think there's a little bit, I think, a misreading of the moment in North America, that probably because inflation is not being presented to the consumer, they're understanding that tariffs have no impact on that. I have a little bit a different view on that. I think it's a matter of lagging. I think this will come at some point in time. And I think let's say the whole supply chain is adjusting to that. And my personal take is that until the end of the year, we're going to see some impact for the consumers in North America also.
Yeah, absolutely. The inflation numbers came out this morning at 2.7%, in line with expectations, but already starting to trend up. So I think we're starting to slowly see that And then as Brazilians, we know how inflation is, and once it starts to pick up, it's hard to turn it around. So, thanks, Guilherme. We'll see if we're collecting some questions. If we have time at the end, we'll come back to you. So, but thank you very much for your participation. Our next speaker is Marco Story, who is a former Deputy Minister of the Economy and Special Secretary of Foreign Trade and International Affairs for Brazil. Marco, it's great to have you back here with us. So pass the word on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Very pleased to be here. Will, about a year and a half ago, Zé Roberto Azevedo and the Brazil Champ team was kind enough to organize a luncheon in which I had an opportunity to speak to you. It was the first time since I left the presidency of the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank. And I remember something that we discussed around the notion that Brazil Cham was about to celebrate its 55th year of anniversary, which is a beautiful trajectory. So congratulations. But my point was that the next 5 years would be more important to Brazil-US relations than the past 55. And the coming 5 years would be more important because globally, we are in the midst of a geopolitical recession. We are back into superpower competition. We are, as Secretary of State Harry Kissinger said, in the foothills of a new Cold War. And then in the middle of all that, you ask, where are the two biggest democracies of the West? And where are the two biggest economies of the hemisphere? And the answer is on July 15th, 2025, they are at odds with each other. It's interesting because even during the presidential campaign all through last year, unlike what is Brazil's tradition, the current Brazilian president was very vocal in supporting one of the candidates, the candidate that did not win, Kamala Harris. And if you take the collection of rhetoric from January 20th by the Brazilian president, there have been numerous occasions, whether on a personal style basis, on a policy grounds, on whether the U.S. is in decline. The U.S. had in the Brazilian president one of the most vocal antagonists. And in the same way that when you have an airplane accident, in general, a number of factors play in. So it's the weather, it's the wearing off of the fuselage, it's a technical mistake. The air controllers might have messed up. Maybe the crew is inexperienced. The pilot is incompetent. So all of the things coming together came to this pressure point of last Thursday when the letter was sent out. It's pretty awesome to realize that only 5.5 years ago, the headquarters of the OECD in Paris were receiving a letter from the US government supporting Brazil's accession to the OECD, which would be a major win for Brazil because Brazil would become the only country in the world to be a member of the BRICS, a member of the G20, and a member of the OECD, now with the very strong support of the US government. So only 5.5 years ago, this was where we were, and this is where we are now. If you read the list of countries whose tariffs have been advertised as of going into effect come August 1st, Brazil's there with 50%, a level that's much higher than that of China, which supposedly is the antagonist of the US in Cold War 2.0. So this is a very bad outcome, very, very bad outcome for Brazil. And it is a very bad outcome for the US. I think the question is now, what do we do about it, right? What do we have on the table that is workable. And if you go by the letter of next week, there are things that we can try and do, and there are things that are very difficult to accomplish, especially given this basically 2-week window that we have before us. As it has been said, and I think my friend and former Director General of the WTO said, when it comes, for example, to social platforms, to social networks, if these two countries valued more the strategic importance of their relations than the current political junctures, we could work on a bilateral committee on social networks. It is true that there is a huge gap between the level of tariffs that Brazil imposes on US exports and the level of tariffs that the US imposes on Brazil's exports. And we can work around that. By the way, when President Trump was there in his first administration, he had in his hand trade promotion authority that Brazil could have used. That is no longer there, and I don't think the political motivation is there. But we can still sit down to work on the tariff level. And it's very, I think, relevant to remark here that the Brazilian government on its side has been enormously incompetent. And it played with both inertia and complacency because it was reading the scenario out there from January 20th, and particularly as of April 2nd. And we have to realize that every single leader, every single senior authority of the G20 economies for this past 4 to 6 months have reached out to the US for negotiating. That has been the case of China. It's been the case of India. It's been the case of the EU. It's been the case of Mexico. Some of these negotiations were bearing fruit. Some have not, but the contact was there. Brazil was the only country in the world that did not have a high contact level. I mean, the exchanges have been basically capped at a very technical threshold. Now, going forward, it seems to me that the one thing that triggered this last wave of retaliations, of putting the pressure up, the heat up, has been the BRICS summit and all of the rhetoric concerning the U.S. Currency and concerning the SWIFT platform system. On the part of Brazil, and particularly on the Brazilian government, this has been there for a while, but it's something that resides much more in the sphere of rhetoric than something that is practical. There are no major interactions between Brazil or India or China or Russia in order to build a common currency, or even to come up with a platform that is workable in providing a significant challenge to the SWIFT system. By moving away this piece of rhetoric, which, by the way, is not doing Brazil any good, and it's not realistic at all, I think that some of the tensions that are now so high would come down, and it would create a very favorable atmosphere for these groups that are now in Brazil preparing to negotiate with the US. By the way, it's very important that calls are put out. Up until this morning, this is Tuesday morning, there has not been any calls between high-level Brazilian authorities and US authorities since Thursday. So it's very important to break the ice, and by engaging in something that would continue to diversify Brazil's trade partners and bring the situation to a juncture where other risks to bilateral relations that go beyond tariffs, like, for example, restrictions to investment, are not there, because at the end of the day, it is true that Brazil is one of the top destinations for US FDI. Brazil is, I mean, the US is the most important source of FDI coming to its country. So it's very, very relevant. We want to make sure, absolutely make sure that this relationship proves to be able to go through the tunnel of political polarity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marcus. That was great. And again, we appreciate your participation and being here with us. And we'll come back to you if we have time at the end with a couple of questions. I've already gotten a couple of things here. Even on my LinkedIn, people say, "Hey, it's great to see you here." So thank you again for your partnership here with us. Oh, and I'm
Thank you.
sorry that my camera was off. Um, Now we're going to move on to a bit to understand what's going from a regulatory perspective, how we can look at these things, what's the legality of some of these things. So we have two senior partners from law firms in the United States that are partners here with us at the chamber to give us their perspectives on things. First of all, we're going to start with Tony Rivera, who's a partner in the customs practice co-leader at Aaron Fox Schiff LLP. So Tony, on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Will, and good morning to everyone. And thank you to the Commerce for bringing us together on this important discussion. Um, as Will mentioned, my name's Tony Rivera, and I'm a partner and co-leader for the customs practice at Aaron Fox Schiff. I'm also a former lawyer at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and have extensive familiarity with trade agreements and their underlying rules for importation into the United States. So it's a pleasure to be speaking with this broad group today that invested in U.S. Brazil commerce, and it's been an impressive panel and discussion with very informative and strategic perspective. So I'm going to highlight a few key points, particularly from the regulatory side. I have a few slides too that can be circulated after the presentation today for just additional reference information. With our attention on these recent U.S. measures targeting Brazilian imports, my discussion will touch upon, as I mentioned, the regulatory background, some of the legal uncertainty in relation to the tariffs, related tariff actions, and notes in relation to that. So recapping with the most pressing development, as we all know, July 9th, the president sent uh, a, a tariff letter to President Lula announcing that the new 50% tariff on Brazilian exports to the United States, which are purportedly going to be effective August 1st. And in connection to the reciprocal tariffs, it would be a dramatic increase from the 10% reciprocal tariffs that the country is currently facing. I'm going to stop here, and this was an important point I thought that was alluded to earlier. This is it's a this isn't an implementation of the tariffs yet. There's been various tariff letters that have been circulated this month to various countries. For the most part, outside of Brazil, they've been to countries that had Liberation Day tariff increases, and those tariffs were reciprocal tariffs under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, or IEPA for short. So I'm going to discuss these points in relation to IEPA reciprocal tariffs. I do want to caveat that, um, and though it seems that's likely the case, it's we need that formal guidance to be absolutely clear. And there's different potential pivot points, I think, from the type of letter and where it could potentially go. Um, i- in relation to this point, and this kind of a regulatory uh, emphasis on it. Um, the implementation will eventually require like an official government action that'll be where the tariff will be implemented in the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States. That'll be announced via the Federal Register, and then there'll be an act like in the harmonized tariff schedule. There'll be a list of the tariff with special codes implementing that tariff. So, for example, the Liberation Day tariffs that were announced on April 2nd, those are included in the HTS-US, but they're specifically noted as being suspended until further notice, essentially, without an actual effective date. That indicates even those tariffs, the ones that were announced April 2nd, were supposed to initially start April 10th, and then paused initially till July 9th and then paused again until August 1st. Those are currently listed officially as suspended. So those technically have to be unsuspended to be increased to the rates. And also various of those rates have changed. So those have to be changed in the official publication. I note all this because Brazil isn't even in the current HTS US publication with respect to IEPA reciprocal tariffs and the ones associated to Liberation Day. So it's just from a regulatory perspective that's a very important development. And as it's been noted, a lot of these letters they have connections to these other tariffs, but they're also in connection to uh, trade negotiation as a general matter, as has been reported. And there's a lot of development still to come from that. A lot of time still between, even in short time periods, a lot of time between now and April and August 1st. So a lot of things can move quickly, and this is very important part of the process to keep paying attention to. So. Um, to this end, and while these are likely reciprocal tariffs, I think importantly in the letter, it also noted, and it also noted the political tensions and the trade tensions, but it did note that these were separate from sectoral tariffs. And again, sectoral tariffs, somewhat of a broad term. I think the general understanding is that these are not specifically like Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, or those other potential trade actions. At the same time, the tariff did mention the Section 301 investigation on uh, digital service taxes, which was another type of tariff regime. So Section 301 is a separate tariff regime and a separate action that can be taken by the government. Section 301's for now been used for some time on products from China in relation to protection against intellectual theft, intellectual property, and that type of activity. This digital service tariff is different. It's looking at unfair trade practices in relation to trade with digital trade companies. So it's another action that's addressed in this letter, and it's until we have kind of the formal guidance as to how this tariff is going to play out. There's different connection points. One including the 301 investigation, which started early this year, but now, as at least from the letter, it seems that Brazil is a part of that investigatory target. So something to keep in mind just in relation to reviewing these developments and how they potentially unfold and what tariff action they come into place. And this distinction is important. And as we'll talk a little bit later in my remarks, there's an uncertainty around IEPA. So the other tariffs in place and what other tariffs they can come under is particularly relevant. Um, the other I think note from the tariff day actions or the tariff letter themselves, I would say, and really in point to the reference of, and this I found interesting too, because when I saw the letter, there's clearly a focus on it notes the trade the trade relationship and indicates the trade deficit, and has been noted on this panel today. There's a trade surplus from the U.S. perspective to its relationship with Brazil. So that language is a bit it's off the point, right, in relation to that particular statistic. One thing to keep in mind just in relation, and this is there's a little bit of there's not an incredible amount of guidance on how the Day tariffs were implemented, what the calculation was by the administration and the counterparts in implementing those tariffs. The, the those initial tariffs did seem to be more connected to the trade deficit question, but notably when these initial investigations or reports of these investigations initially came out, which was really at the time of the inauguration back in January, where the presidential administration issued a memorandum on American trade and various directives for various agencies to perform investigations and reports on various issues. One of them being this reciprocal universal tariff type implementation. In uh, I guess that guidance and the reports from the White House that came out around that time, it wasn't just specifically the trade deficit that was being uh, considered as one of the factors for these reciprocal tariffs. The VAT was another one which was included. There was some connection to digital service taxes, and there was also more broadly just other trade barriers or other actions that might make it difficult for the U.S. to import into the other country. And that resonates because I have noted, and importantly, during this panel, the references to potential currency issues. I think issues in relation to IP protections that can come about, and I think also at the same time the digital trade service that was specifically mentioned in the letter. Those could potentially have that nexus back to the IEPA reciprocal tariffs. And that's part of the reason why I think it seems to be going in that direction, at least from what we know right now. But again, very important to see how these end up playing out. Um, my last point in relation to these various tariffs, and then I'll have one other point on reciprocal tariffs before I conclude. But for the for these various tariff regimes, because since the administration has started, we have the IEPA reciprocal tariffs, which are those Liberation Day tariffs. We have separate fentanyl IEPA tariffs on specific countries that wouldn't be Brazil at this time. Then we have Section 232 tariffs, which are those on steel and aluminum and derivative products of those. And we also have Section 301 tariffs currently just on China, but that Section 301 is something that could potentially come into play with digital service tax. There's a very important question as to what's the cumulative effect of those tariffs. It's called stacking too. Some of those tariffs add together. Some of those tariffs, if you pay one, you don't have to pay the other. That's an important kind of consideration in all of this. Reciprocal tariffs, for the most part, in various regimes, they won't stack with 232 tariffs. Now that's going to be very specific to the tariff regime. So when new tariff regimes are announced, the language there will be relevant, but at least historically, there has been some exemption where if you pay a 232 tariff for steel aluminum, you wouldn't necessarily pay the reciprocal IEPA tariff. Section 301, if you're looking at it from like China, that one stacks with the other one. So you pay the 25% China tariff, you pay the reciprocal tariff on top of that. So if it becomes a digital service tax issue, that's something to pay attention to, especially if you're in one industry that has 232 already on steel and aluminum, potentially eventually on aircrafts or things of that nature. Those tariffs could add. Um, so that's a bit of the background on the tariff regimes, the current the letter that was imposed, and the regulatory background. My last point here is just on the uncertainty to um, to the IEPA tariffs in general right now. As many of you know, these the legality of implementing tariffs under the IEPA, under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, was challenged in court in early June, and it was the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled that they were invalid tariffs. That order was appealed, and with the appeal of that order, and there was been other U.S. courts with similar outcomes, but the U.S. Court of International Trade is the uh, one that has the national jurisdiction on these type of tariffs, and is historically the federal district court that adheres to these type of decisions. So their decision was that it was invalid. It was appealed to the Court of Appeals of the Federal Circuit. In that appeal, there was a stay of the order, meaning that the IEPA reciprocal tariffs and the IEPA fentanyl tariffs, which are the other IEPA tariffs currently existing, those will stay in effect until the issue is resolved in litigation, and this could go up through the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's a lot to play out as to whether these tariffs will stay in effect. But as this plays out, these tariffs will still be collected, and clearly the U.S. government's using um, eh, leveraging the effect of these tariffs, even increasing these tariffs beyond 10%, or at least indicating they will through these tariff letters. So a lot to play out, and the tariffs are still being collected, but it is still ultimately a legal decision that will be made at the end of the day. I think the next event to watch out there. There's an oral argument at the CF the Court of Appeals July 31st. and then further decisions after that. So still a ways to go before any particular resolution there. Um, and I'll cede my time there. I think main thing, just to note, monitor. These are very important developments, and there's mitigation strategies around them. Part of them, alternative markets or different rules that can come into place. But right now, it's a lot of monitoring and kind of in that preparation phase to see what the next steps are probably going to be. And
Great.
with that,
Yeah,
sure thing.
thanks, Tony. Appreciate it. We'll come back to you in a few minutes with some questions at
Sure.
the end there. And last but not least, we have Brian Genovitz, who's a partner at DLL Piper, one of our members here in New York, who's going to wrap up on the remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, Brian, on to you. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Glad to be with you. My name is Brian Janovitz, and as mentioned, I'm a partner in our national security and global trade practice, but just joined earlier this year. I spent the last 13 years in the U.S. government doing a lot of trade litigation, negotiating a fair number of free trade agreements when the U.S. government was engaged in more of that activity. I was a director of financial economics at the White House for the National Security Council and National Economic Council, and was chief China counsel, overseeing a lot of the more recent investigatory activity as well as tariff policy. And so, obviously a lot's already been said here, and I want to avoid repeating much of it that I agree with. So maybe what I'll do is make a few observations around the kind of broader dynamics and negotiating mechanics, and then pivot a little bit to more of what I think companies can be doing now and in the near future in light of these developments. So, and again, this is not to be a comprehensive summary, but just to maybe add a little bit of color to what's already been said. So, as has been noted, there's not a trade deficit here to address. That being said, the types of things that partner governments would normally negotiate with the United States over in order to try to address that concern still are in play here, right? It's things like investment in the United States. It's things like purchasing U.S. exports. And it could even be cooperation on other geostrategic objectives. Those are still on the table. Those are still attractive to the Trump administration, even if they don't speak directly to that trade deficit concern. Their currency in that negotiation and they're worth thinking about as being on the table. Then, of course, beyond that trade deficit concern, the letter itself did mention and order a Section 301 investigation related to digital trade concerns. Those concerns are very real. They're longstanding. They've been discussed over the last few years between these governments. That's another area where the Brazilian government can engage with the United States and try to make headway, and there's a real negotiation to be had there. Also, I think it's probably worth mentioning that a number of folks have registered their surprise at some of the announcements. I think it's fair to say this was probably not something that had long been in the works. Probably the best indication of that, and we're reading tea leaves a little here, but that because this Section 301 investigation was ordered, but it has not yet been announced in the Federal Register, which is kind of the official record for these types of regulatory announcements, suggests to me that this was not something that was in the can and ready to go, but that there's a period of time here now where they're getting, the lawyers are all dotting their I's and crossing their T's, getting that out the door. So that's probably a pretty good signal that this came about somewhat quickly. In terms of how this plays out, as is mentioned, there are a number of political dynamics that influence each side's calculation. I will say, as it relates to the concerns from President Trump in the letter about the trial in Brazil and those types of things, there's not as a natural political constituency here for that in the same way that there are for significant commercial interests. So if the tariffs bite and begin to take hold and commercial actors on both sides begin to engage with the governments, the legislative pressure here also engages with the White House, it's not clear that will have the same level of political constituency that you might expect in other concerns that are put on the table in these types of trade negotiations. That's maybe something that can influence the dynamics here. There was some reference to whether Brazil would retaliate with tariffs of its own, as has been previewed. Of course, the letter from the United States says any tariffs that go into place that are retaliatory will be responded to again in kind, and that sort of puts you into that escalatory cycle. That being said, there was a suggestion that maybe Brazil would opt for IP retaliation in the IP or the services sphere. The only thing I would note there is, when you do that sort of thing that isn't traditional, it isn't tarification, it isn't directed specifically at one particular partner, that can send difficult signals to other trading partners around the world. So, for example, China recently put in place export controls on rare earths. That reverberated globally, and even as those licenses have begun to be granted, and those in Europe and other places begin to get access to that, that does trigger some insecurity in those partners about what's possible going forward, what choke points can be, for lack of a better word, weaponized. And so there could be longer run ramifications to that type of non-traditional retaliation that I think governments will want to and likely will pay attention to. And then, of course, there are other things that are less interesting, but will be on the table as part of negotiation. Things like lowering tariffs on ethanol and other places where the United States has long sought lower tariffs on U.S. exports to Brazil. So maybe those are just a few kind of observations in addition to what others have said about the high-level negotiations. In terms of what companies can be doing now, obviously I did mention the Section 301 investigation that will presumably get up and running on the digital trade measures. Companies can and should comment there. That's an opportunity for companies, whether it's in the US or in Brazil, to make their views known about that. It's also worth noting that in Section 301 investigations, assuming that there is a finding of unfair trade practices and a remedial stage is reached, that remedy does not need to relate to the investigated practice. So just because a company isn't a digital services company or isn't somehow impacted by the particular trade practice that's under investigation doesn't mean that retaliation from the United States couldn't hit that particular product. So again, to give an example, during the first Trump administration, there was an investigation of China's IP-related practices, including forced technology transfer. When it came time for retaliation in the form of broad-based tariffs, which, by the way, remain in place and were expanded during the Biden administration, they targeted a whole range of products, many of which had no connection, or at least no established connection, to forced technology transfer, IP-related offenses. So companies shouldn't feel safe just because they're not, squarely within the crosshairs of the investigated practice. So again, that does provide an outlet for companies to engage now. I think there's a reference to inventory, especially with what we're seeing here, where you have these kind of short-term spikes in tariffs. It's not clear they're going to stay in place long-term. The more that companies can build up inventory in the United States, that provides a timing flexibility that can be really important. It's not a long-term solution, but if you're worried about whether it's this 50% tariff coming into place for a week or 2 weeks, or as governments engage in more detailed negotiations, the Trump administration has shown a willingness to spike tariffs in response to those negotiating dynamics. With the foresight of those types of short-term spikes in mind, there are mitigation steps that can be taken, like building up inventories in the United States. Companies can be looking at their existing contracts as well as their negotiation of future contracts going forward, and how that deals with both now existing tariffs as well as what should be anticipated tariffs that may not be in existence yet, how the responsibility for paying those will take place. I may also just pause here to make, probably should have been my first section, but one more observation, which is one place that I found over time, I think economists kind of get some of this stuff wrong, is by applying economic logic as if it's a certainty, and it doesn't take into account the difference between short-term and long-term considerations. So oftentimes, in terms of who will absorb the tariffs, you'll see companies that maybe in the long term can't sustain exports to a particular market if those tariffs remain in place. But they aren't going to immediately, or oftentimes won't want to immediately pivot from that market and give up that market share if they're not confident that those tariffs are going to remain in place long term. And so you see companies that do behave differently in the short term than you might expect them to behave over the long term. And so anyway, as companies begin to get into these types of contractual negotiations, they can allocate responsibility for tariffs and how that burden will be shared going forward. There are also steps companies can take to lower their tariff exposure. So tariffs largely are a function of a country of origin attached to a good, and the rate and then the product at issue. But that the value of that good is not necessarily, there's a lot of legal complexity to determining what the value is. And companies may not have paid close attention to that in the past in a low tariff environment, maybe a zero tariff environment where it didn't really have all that much meaning. Now we've helped companies a lot go back to look and say, okay, is this really the right value to declare? Are there ways under the law to reduce the duty bill value and reduce the duty exposure? It may also be possible that in kind of complicated manufacturing, you can change the site of certain aspects of that process and switch the origin. And in an environment like this one, where all of a sudden you have very differentiated tariff rates from one source versus another, there could be potentially huge tariff savings there as well. For larger operations that are serving lots of different markets, there are maybe opportunities for kind of export shuffling to kind of figure out what other markets, the high tariff goods can go to, and maybe you have another source of a similar good that you can use to serve the U.S. market at a lower rate. Beyond that, though, we have encouraged companies, and this may go back to some of my previous roles in the government, to thinking strategically a bit more in the medium and long term. It was mentioned earlier that the other largest market that Brazil trades with of the United States is China. But of course, there are strategic risks there as well. So as companies get into supply chain planning, more so than in the past, there may be a need to consider things like duplication or redundancies that give their supply chains a bit more resilience, even if it comes with greater near-term costs. One of the things that we have been doing is trying to advise companies on how to take into account those types of geostrategic risks in their medium and long-term supply chain planning, so that they are better equipped to deal with not just the tariff that's coming in place in August, but more of this type of shifting. And unfortunately, as each one of these deadlines nears, I will hear people say, well, at least finally we're getting to a place where we'll have certainty. And I think the bad news is we aren't. Certainty is not coming for us. There will continue to be uncertainty. Businesses are going to have to make decisions amidst uncertainty, but there's a difference between uncertainty and not knowing anything. And there are ways that companies can make better choices by factoring in the different geostrategic risks appropriately and assessing their options in that regard. So I'm looking at the clock and realizing we are coming up very closely to the end. So maybe I will stop there so we leave some time for questions. And of course, happy to answer anything and follow up as well.
Great, thanks, Brian. And just because that was one of the questions we had from the audience, going through a different country or diversifying where with your origin is of products would suffice, even if it's a Brazilian company or operation somewhere else, that would suffice to fall for the tariff for whatever the country that's originating from.
Yeah, well, the tariff applies to the goods legal origin. So if it's of a different legal origin, it doesn't matter that the company or the producer is headquartered in Brazil or in some other way identifies as a Brazilian company. That said, and there are usually complex rules around what confers origin on a good. But if it is a Brazilian good, meaning it has Brazilian origin, and let's say it's after August 1st and it is subject to the 50% tariff, merely sending it to another country first does not help. I mean,
right.
You can send it to the EU, but when it comes to the United States, you're still going to have to
really where it's produced that matters.
Legal origin as yes, and it's either where it was wholly produced or obviously many goods cross borders a lot now. The general test is where the last place where the good was substantially transformed. Although that, of course, does get into a complicated legal question that we oftentimes will help companies figure out.
Great. Tony, any comments on that? Or
Oh no, I was just great comment by Brian. I was just going to add the other side of that is transshipment. So you've heard that probably recently. If you're just sending the good to the other country, it doesn't substantially transform. That's the transshipment question. And still, in some of these letters, the question of what transshipment is being meant by the administration is something to pay attention to.
everything is a question.
Yeah, everything. A lot of
Great.
uncertainty.
Guilherme, one question for you regarding to inventories. If Suzano has built up inventories here in the United States as a way to hedge the situation, at least in the short term.
Yes, we are looking into that right now. We kind of speed up the shipping, the vessel speeds actually to the US and diverted some volumes from other markets to increase our inventories. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Marcos, a couple of questions for you. I'm going to try to summarize them into one and then give you the floor. But one on the China relation, what can we expect there? I mean, obviously you spent a lot of time there with BRICS presidency there, and so where do you think that's going? I think a second question, which I thought was a good one. Do you expect the Brazilian government to start to react more in a more senior level rather than the silence that we've had? Or do we think that the political side of the short-term political gains for the government will win that battle at this point? And if you have any comments on everything that we've seen from the U.S. administration seems to be inflationary. So what are your any thoughts on that as well? Thank you.
Well, let me begin by the second question. It's been widely recognized that the polarity and the confrontation with the Trump administration pays political dividends to internal audiences. It's been the case of Canada, it's been the case of Mexico, it's been the case of France. There might be a window for the current administration in Brazil to try and extract benefits from both words. One, continuing to vocalize opposition to the Trump view of the world and the emphasis that on the previous 2 years of Lula's administration on democracy, increasingly replaced by the notion of sovereignty, playing with Brazil's nationalism. So not necessarily bringing down the level of rhetoric there, but at the same time trying and score another political win to a constituency that the Lula administration has all but lost, which is the business sector and the so-called Faria Limers, by trying to bring the currently announced level of tariffs to something closer to what's being announced towards the EU and Mexico. So I do think that there's going to be more higher level engagement. And I think the Lula administration would try to do that. To the extent that that will be successful, I think it depends very much on what kind of concessions, even if only at the rhetorical level, may be pocketed by the Trump administration as political wins. And I think the rhetoric around an alternative system to SWIFT and an alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency might be the case. When it comes to inflations, to inflationary pressures, yes, I think at sooner rather than later, this will be felt by the American consumer. No country in the world has as many multinational firms operating in different jurisdictions as the United States. So this is inflationary, and it also is very contrarian to dividends to be paid to US stockholders if the activities that take place overseas by these American multinational firms have to be faced with higher tariffs, even when their exports are back to the US. So it is inflationary. And at one particular point, we're going to be seeing is the numbers that were announced this morning, I think, point in that direction. Now, with relations vis-a-vis China, these are the numbers now, Will. So out of $2 that Brazil exports, $1 goes to Asia. Out of the $100 that Brazil exports, 33 go to China. Out of the $100 that Brazil exports, 12 go to the US, although as it's been very extensively discussed here, Brazil exports to the US are higher value added goods, more technology. There's great favoritism on the part of the current administration to get closer and closer to China, not only in terms of the commercial sphere, but also in terms of having Brazil as a bigger and bigger destination for Chinese FDI, and favoritism toward resorting to Chinese sources of longer term financial investment. This plays well to China because there's more and more restrictions to China's FDI into the US, into Canada, into Mexico, into Europe, even some of its neighbors. I was in India recently, and I thought it was enormously interesting to realize that although there is a very strong anti-China sentiment in the US, the anti-China sentiment in the US is breakfast compared to the anti-sentiment of China in India. A lot of restrictions. So, and the Chinas have to keep on investing abroad, especially in those countries where they have not only an opportunity to diversify their portfolio, but a destination that plays well into their strategic objectives that, for example, guaranteeing food and energy security. So we are going to see indeed more and more FDI into Brazil. And that is why I think it's so important, so strategic for Brazil to keep on diversifying. The EU-Mercosur agreement that was alluded to here must be made effective. And once again, I'm hoping Brazil and the US come back again. It's a waste. It's a waste of opportunity. It's a waste of energy. We should be doing things together rather than imposing tariffs and restrictions on one another.
Great, thanks. As one of the comments that was here, one of the questions, I mean, there's some huge U.S. companies like the airlines, but also Starbucks. Was mentioned that 30% of coffee in the U.S. comes from Brazil. Kimberly-Clark, obviously, a huge client for Suzano. So it'll be interesting to see eventually the pushback from the U.S. companies on these tariffs, and in some cases, the lack of other suppliers that they can have there. Well, I want to end here. We're almost out of time, so I want to thank all our speakers very much for the conversation over the last 90 minutes. I hope that all of you listening enjoyed it as much as I did. Obviously, a lot of question marks still as to where we're going, but I think discussions like this are very important to highlight the importance of this, the impact that this could have on both sides of the trade, not just on the Brazil side. And that communications like this are super important for us to get to a better solution. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating. And we look forward to seeing you again in our next event from the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. Have a great day. Bye-bye.